The economy was rocking prior to the pandemic. What has the Biden administration inherited from the Trump administration? A recession? Hello from Washington, D.C., our national capital. I'm Chuck Kyle, a 30-year strategic planner, strategic communications expert, retired intelligence officer, and a D.C. transplant from West Virginia. One of the keys to maintaining the White House in 2024 is the administration's performance with the economy. According to Professor Lichtman, author of Predicting the Next President, the rule of thumb is that a good economy helps the incumbent party, and a lousy one, well, it hurts. A good economy does not guarantee the White House, yet a bad one, no incumbent administration has won re-election in any of the 10 elections in which the economy was in a recession during the fall campaign. This includes the Trump administration. So the question today is, how are we going to assess the Biden administration during the fall campaign of 2024? What is a recession? And how are we going to objectively measure the short-term economy? And lastly, can we apply this to the competitive states of 2024? How do you measure how the economy is doing? Comment below. Good morning, Dana. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. Have my coffee. How are you?
Doing well. Once again, we have Dr. Dana Stryk in the house with us today, and she's going to talk to us about recessions, whether or not we're in one, and how we're going to measure the Biden administration. So the first question, are we in a recession?
Before we dive into data, let's think about what that means anecdotally. So for example, suppose you're graduating from school, getting out of school, high school, college, it really doesn't matter. Or you currently have a job and you want to start looking for another one. If we're in an expansion, what that would look like is you start looking for a job and you get a lot of offers. In fact, you have so many offers, you could probably start negotiating the terms of your employment a little bit better than you expected. If it's a recession, that's when that college grad or that high school grad puts in their application to some job openings, but there's a lot of competition for those jobs. And in fact, it could take a while, if at all, to get a job. And so a lot of times when we talk about recessions, we relate it to the labor market. And so just anecdotally, that's what it would sort of feel like. When we feel good about how things are going, that tends to be an expansion. And when things aren't going so well economically, we can kind of feel them. Now, in getting into the technical definition, many different ways we could measure this, but sort of a consensus of one variable we can use is this thing called GDP. And all GDP does is it measures the value of what's produced in the economy. And can I use a graph?
Absolutely.
So if we look at a graph of real GDP growth over time, so that's in this graph, that's that blue line, I can see that it moves around. Growth increases, and there are even times when GDP growth is negative. One way that we can define a recession is I need something to compare current growth to, some sort of reference point, if you will. And one thing I might do is compare it to that red line, which is the average growth rate over the period. And so a quick, easy way to define if we're in a recession is when that blue line, annual growth, is below the red line, average growth. That's when that person going out and getting a job isn't going to find one too easily.
What is a good objective measure that captures the public's perception?
I think when we're talking about capturing the public's perception, it's going to be comparing today, right now, to what do I think should be going on. I think that this will be sort of what I said is compare today's growth to what it's been in the past. We see this a lot in other countries where even if the economy is doing okay, if people think growth should be higher, then you're going to have people that are dissatisfied and they're going to perceive the economy is not doing well.
So a real quick question. You'll typically hear politicians talk about the recession. So is there like a political definition compared to an economist's definition?
Yeah, as you and I have talked about this before, if you poll most people or if you look at a textbook from when you or and I were in school, it's going to say 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. Very technical. And the economics profession has moved away from that for many reasons. But if you think of it like a politician, recessions are bad. I can't think of anything like, oh, wow, yay, we're in a recession. No one is going to say that. And so I want to define it in a way that they don't happen that often. And so the technical definition that most people will say, which economists call the political definition, is that 2 consecutive quarters of GDP growth. But it misses a lot.
We listen to something like Planet Money, and they talk about the inverted yield curve and these other items. How are we going to be able to apply this to the competitive states in 2024's fall campaign?
I think one great thing about GDP data is we have it at the state level. And I think there are two ways we can approach this. One is just sort of what I said nationally. We do the same thing for every state. We look at what is the current growth rate of real GDP and compare it to an average. Except that, so we live in Virginia, and I have no idea what Virginia's real GDP growth has been. That's not reported. But I do know what the nation's growth is. And so for my state of North Carolina, for example, where I grew up, which is in, last year when you were doing the analysis of the election, that was one of the battleground states. If whatever growth rate is in North Carolina is lower than the national average, those states, people who live in those states might feel like they're left behind. And I think that that's going to be a good way, a quick and easy and objective way to measure how people would feel.
There was one other thing you just stated that reminded me of one last question for you. It's kind of a tricky question.
Uh-oh.
Are we currently in a recession? And what did the Biden administration inherit from the Trump administration?
Imagine this. Can I use another graph?
Yes.
And so this is a graph of what has happened since 2019 to the U.S. economy. So each one of these dots, and you can see a number in it, here's the techie jargon, the annualized quarterly growth rate for GDP. And what that means is I went from GDP from quarter one to quarter two, saw what it is, and I said, what is that rate if the economy grew at that rate for 4 quarters, not just one? So that's what those numbers are. And you can see the economy is plodding along in 2019. And then starting in 2020, boom, coronavirus hits. And we have a pretty substantial drop in GDP. You can see January 2020 annualized quarterly growth is a negative 5%. And keep in mind, that's just really March. And then in the second quarter, 31% contraction. And then it jumps right back up to 33% in the third quarter and a little slower in the fourth. So using the political definition, we're not in a recession right now, but I think you have to think of it in a little different terms. I would say we are, and we are because we have not returned back to where we were prior to this shock, prior to the pandemic. And as we talked in the other, in the jobs report video, that's what the Biden administration needs to do, is they need to get people out and about in the economy safely so that these dots continue going up, because what is troubling is first quarter growth was a contraction.
All right. So I lied. I have one last question.
Oh, of course you do.
So prior to the pandemic, one of the strategic communications and messaging that was out of the White House was this was one of the greatest economies ever. And from an economics perspective, could you look at the 3 years of the Trump administration prior to the pandemic and make the comment, this is the strongest economy the U.S. has had?
No.
Okay.
Can't do it. Well, I think economists always get upset when it's, the greatest something ever. How are you defining that? If we look at real GDP growth, no. We've had other periods of time where the economy has grown much faster. You'd have to look at other indicators. And I don't see, unemployment has been pretty low, but as we've talked about, there's more behind that number. So I would say, no, this was not the greatest economy ever.
All
It
right.
wasn't the worst, well, pandemic-wise, but excluding 2020, but it certainly wasn't the best.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. So if anybody has any questions for Dr. Dana Stryk, please drop them below. And as always, trust but verify. If you like this video and content, please hit the like button and subscribe. When you subscribe, add in the comments, I subscribed. And until next time, trust but verify.